It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers. Here we are on another new episode of your favorite podcast. If it's not your favorite podcast, you need to go to the Apple iTunes store or wherever you download the podcast and give us a rate and review and make it your favorite podcast. Today on the program, we have Professor Michael Delahoyde. He is a clinical professor of English at Washington State University, and along with his research partner, Colleen Moriarty, they have been spending their summers deep in the archives of Italy, discovering new and wonderful details about the journeys, the stayings, the findings, the doings of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Welcome, Michael and Colleen. Glad to have you.
Hello, Stephen.
I understand, Michael, that you not too long ago have just returned from your latest foray into Italy and have come back with some new details to share with us.
That's right. So we have now spent 5 summers in Italy. The first one was just to be for a couple of weeks, but we were so addicted to it that we just kept calling and staying longer and changing our flights. And so we ended up there about a month. But since then, we have pushed as far as we can in going abroad and spending 3 months each time, including just to a couple of weeks ago.
You pulled an Earl of Oxford. You extended your stay, and it wasn't until the Queen sent for you and said you must come home now.
Well, until I ran out of lands to sell, I kept calling back and saying, sell more stuff on eBay. I need to stay longer.
Oh, you sold your lands to see other men's. Isn't that how it goes?
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about what you did on this most recent journey. Where were you? What did you dive into? How long did you stay deep in the dark undergrounds of catacombs? Share with us a little of those details.
Okay, well, after the first several years, we have finally expanded the number of cities that we decided we should check out, because what we found the first year was kind of a beginner's luck. We found the best documents. And the second year, we realized this is way more tangled and complex than we thought because of the ambassadorial connections. It's a web extending throughout Italy and beyond, where the ambassadors from Paris or to Venice or from Florence or to Rome, they're all chatting and it's all very gossipy. And so this is where the Earl of Oxford tends to be showing up. It's that when he goes into Europe, into Paris, the ambassadors, diplomats there are saying, here's an important young man that we should pay attention to and we should extend privileges and courtesies to, and he wants to see Italy. And so they're writing to Venice, and that seems to be Oxford's first important stop.
So he takes a trip to Paris. He hangs out there for a little while, and then he reveals to them, I'm interested in going to Italy. Can somebody help me get there? Because I think a lot of our listeners don't understand that it wasn't like you just went down to the passport office, got yourself a passport, booked passage, and took off to a foreign country. You had to have permission. You had to have letters of introduction, and it helped if you had credentials from a high-ranking official or someone of royalty from another country, right?
That's right. And the same is true for us. We need letters of introduction and official academic, authority to get into some of these places that we're exploring. But the Earl of Oxford, nobody, Will Shakespeare of Stratford, he couldn't just decide, I need a vacation because I sold a lot of gloves or something this year. You do have to get all this permission, and it's especially touchy when you're going into Italy. They don't want you there because this is a Catholic country. They don't want the Catholic influence on you, and it's especially going to be touchy diplomatically and politically. And that's especially what we discovered this last year, that we started out thinking that we need to look at 1575 and 1576 when the Earl of Oxford is there. And we want documents for that. Actually, originally, we thought, well, maybe he would want to have kept contact with his connections there, and he would have wanted to send back, especially after pirates stole his stuff, he would want to send back to the main courts the aristocrats and get more scores of music and maybe texts and books and such. So are there records of requests like that? So we originally went, or my original idea was going to find all these years of possible documents where he may have kept touch. In fact, I originally thought the problem is that William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's chief advisor, treasurer, spy master, etc., since he and his son Robert Cecil, the despised, clearly shredded all evidence of him in England, that it was a long shot to go to England and look for documents on the Earl of Oxford, but possibly they could not have squashed everything, eliminated everything worldwide. So why not go to Italy and see if there's documentary evidence there of his interests in the arts, in music and theater and so on. So initially I thought, well, okay, we'll look at these years and maybe we'll find some bills of sale, or maybe his agents are trying to get some of these musical scores. But we didn't realize, I vastly underestimated the warehouses full, the cathedrals full of documents, all the materials. So we are barely able to get out of 1575 and 76 when he was there, much less look at, maybe in the 80s he's trying to reconnect to get some musical scores. Instead, the diplomatic relationships are involved. So when the Earl of Oxford leaves England a couple of years ago, I thought, he's not just going to be allowed to go traveling because he wants to see some plays, or he heard that Giulio Romano was a really cool artist. He decided
and a sculptor too.
And he would have been taken aside, even if that were the case. He would have been taken aside by somebody, by the Queen, by Lord Burleigh, by some ministers, to say, all right, you are in touchy territory. We have not had ambassadorial relations with Venice for a couple decades now, and we want them. So what Colleen and I have been finding is all the evidence that this was an ongoing concern with Elizabeth. She was really annoyed that the Venetians are listening to the Pope saying, have nothing to do with England. And the Venetians don't care so much about the religion, but they care about the high seas, and they care about merchantry, and they care about money.
They're right. Yeah, they were absolutely the New York harbor of their day, right? They're the most cosmopolitan city in the world.
That's right. Yeah, so they care less about religion. They care more about, let's consider these relations. But on the surface, they don't do anything about it. And Elizabeth is annoyed. She repeatedly, throughout her reign, tries to do something to reestablish these relationships. She tries to guilt them into saying, is it because I'm a woman that you don't do this? Well, if so, and then she gives them, she rails at them. But it's almost certain that the Earl of Oxford would have been taken aside by somebody and said, all right, you're going to Italy. You're going into Italy. While you're in Venice, you certainly don't want to say all of this, and you do want to say all of this, and it's very touchy. So I think that somebody would have said that you need to promote the idea of ambassadorial relations with England, because when he comes out in 1576, he tells the Venetian ambassador in Paris that it's a done deal, that they voted, and we now have an ambassador. And our problem in discovering this and getting the original unavailable translation of the letter last year is that never happened. That either the Venetians told Oxford, it's good, you can go back, a success, you've made the deal, or he decided it was politically advantageous to lie and say, we've now got a connection with Venice when he went to Paris. Or we decided this year, maybe there's a third possibility, that he didn't like Morosini, the ambassador. He thought he was too officious or something, and he decided to play a joke on him and lie. And then Morosini, embarrassingly, in this letter to Venice, has to say, hey, Doge, why wasn't I told here? What's going on? So we don't know, but it is a problem because that did not happen. And the years went by. We revisited this issue in the later dates. 1591, this is brought up again and voted in, and the Venetians, the Senate says, yeah, let's do this. Let's get ambassadorial relations reestablished. And then some special council says, let's defer. And it doesn't happen.
So
and then
his
not
trip,
until Elizabeth...
If his trip is sanctioned by the crown, then, or he can't go, right? He can't just run off to the continent without permission. They would send someone after him, right? So his trip is sanctioned. They did send someone after him.
The previous time he took off in 1574.
Oh, yeah. And she went. Yeah, she did. She said, no, I don't think so. But this time she lets him go with the idea that he must be carrying some kind of papers with him that say, I'm here representing my country and here's what we're looking for. Right. So he's not just a playboy running around Italy. He's there on a purpose and just happens to also be enjoying his great time while he's there.
Yes. And what it looks like more specifically is that he did have a mission. And I always feel that the line that Othello gives, that I've done some service to the state and they know it, is very electric. And it's Oxford reminding the political body that he has done something important.
Absolutely.
And this has to be it. But it is so hush-hush that he's not leaving the traces that we expect to find. Now, when Sir Philip Sidney in 1574 goes into Italy, he has to register, and anybody would have to register with all these bureaus, the Collegio, the Senate, the Concilio di Dieci, just everybody has paperwork, like we face too when we go into the archives. But Oxford is not showing up where he should. He should have had to give an exposition when he goes there, explaining why he is there and what he has to say and so on. And it's just not there. So certainly it seems as if he's got some kind of more important diplomatic mission underway than anybody flaky like Sir Philip Sidney would have had. And he's not leaving the traces.
He had to be armed with some sort of documentation, right? He had to have some kind of paper in his pocket that says, here are my papers, here are my permissions, my letters of introduction, or whatever that needed to be. Do we have any record of any of that at all?
No, I don't believe we do. Certainly not that ends up staying in Italy. But yes, he would have had to have letters of presentation and okays so he could get around. But I think that he would have gotten to where he was supposed to go officially. And maybe he would have had a generic letter of presentation. But once he got into Italy, what it looks like from what we're finding, and especially what we're not finding, is that he decided to disappear. He decided to go incognito and fly beneath the gondola and
nice. I like that.
Just not show up because we know that there's a letter back to Burleigh saying that the Earl of Oxford turned down a home, and the speculation is that he did that because he didn't want to be spied on all the time. I think he just got fed up with the politics and the state dinners and the ambassadorial relationships and what you're supposed to say and not supposed to say and the straitjacketing of all that politics, and he disappeared. He went incognito, and then he completely disappears, and this is really frustrating. He shoots himself in the foot by not leaving any traces officially. And the archives, the state archives in all these cities that we've been to are not picking up on him. He has some network in place, or he's meeting people through other people, and he can avoid the Medicis in Florence. He can avoid anybody in Siena because there's nobody in charge, and he's staying with private families who can show him the plays or introduce him to the music. But that doesn't leave the traces in the state archives.
That's why he loves Siena so much. That's why it's one of his favorite Italian cities, right? And he in my mind, he immerses himself in the underground of the players, of the common players, the actors and artists whom he loves so well and feels so much at home with.
He may have, because he loves that so much, we speculate he may have disguised himself. So going incognito doesn't mean you have to put on a phony mustache and, a funny hat and then sneak around. But he may have enjoyed the fact, as we do, that when you're in Italy, people mistake you for Italian if you're really good at it. And after 5 years, we can be pretty good before they detect it. If you know how to use the money and you know the language pretty well, it's really flattering when you realize, oh, I passed for Italian. Well, especially so for him too, and liking to act like that and duck out from the politics. So our problem is that we can find documents that have to do with the politics because people are gossiping, but not that they're appreciating the right thing, that he's here to see theater, that he's here to find out about Italian music or poetry and the arts.
There's no gossip amongst these diplomats. There's no gossipy mention of him appearing on stage or surrounding himself with the commedia actors or anything of that nature that may have been looked down upon and thus somebody might have written about?
Unfortunately, no, they're not concerned about that. They're concerned about how Catholic he is and how corruptible, and maybe he could be as an assassin for Elizabeth. Well, they don't say that, but it's all the politics of him, not the arts of him. The one thing we found the first year that was closest to him as an artist and appreciator of the arts was that he left a trace with the Concilio de Dieci, the Council of Ten in Venice, a pretty austere organization that was in charge of condemning you to death if you were a traitor. He petitioned to see their secret chambers, and you could try to say that it's because he wanted, some inside information about how the Italian politics works, but he wasn't asking to sit in on a meeting. He wanted to see the chambers. And what's in the chambers there are glorious Renaissance works of art all over the walls and ceilings. And these are enormous halls that general people could not get into. Even nobles could not get into. You'd have to get special permission. So he seeks that, and he leaves traces of his name in Latin and Italian, and he calls himself the most illustrious Edward, Earl of Oxford, because first, that's the way the Venetians call themselves, and second, he's not very modest.
No, our guy, if anything, is definitely not modest.
But the beautiful thing about those signatures is that you can look at that and you say, here's someone who is proud of his handwriting, his writing, and proud of himself, his identity. And that's something you don't get out of Stratford, and you do get in Shakespeare.
Absolutely. I'd say that's definitely a huge connection. What about connection? You talk about how much he loved these works of art and how much he tried so desperately to get in to see very elite pieces of art that are reserved for only the highest ranking people in the most elite locations. What about that connection to the works of Shakespeare and the plays as we know them?
One of the goals we had was to pinpoint when was he in Mantua. And we have turned that archive upside down because Giulio Romano is the only artist mentioned by Shakespeare by name in The Winter's Tale.
Yes.
But there are half a dozen plays where he mentions the idea of perspective art. He thinks perspective art, or what we would call op art, optical illusion art, is the coolest thing. And Giulio Romano is known for this, and Mantua is full of this all over the place. There are alleyways that mean nothing where Giulio Romano has done this this work that makes it look 3D. It makes it look like you've got a 3D surface on a flat surface. He painted on a flat surface, and the shadowing and the illusion is brilliant. And I think Shakespeare, since he mentions this idea of perspective art so often, wanted to think, how can I transpose the idea of perspective art, this illusion, into literature? And I believe that when he writes a play that critics and audiences typically want to say is sexist, but change your perspective, move a little to a different position, and look at it again, and it turns out Taming of the Shrew is anything but that.
I absolutely agree with you. And I've been arguing that for years and years, that it's actually the reverse of that, that it demonstrates how well a couple can succeed when they work in partnership together.
Exactly. And what happens is you don't beat a shrew into submission. You don't break her spirit. You train her or teach her how to act. And acting, not even behaving, but acting is the thing.
Correct.
Or if you have another play that seems to everybody, oh, this is kind of an embarrassment because Shakespeare was a man of his time, and let's not even worry about Merchant of Venice. And look at it from a slightly different perspective, even slightly different perspective, and realize this is not a comedy, this is not funny, this is a horror story. Then it's not racist. Or Henry V, perspective art, is mentioned in that play too. Is this a flag-waving hooray for the imperialist, soulless Machiavellian Henry and England? Or is this a critique of the play? There, perspective art. So I think that Shakespeare was able to take Giulio Romano's work visually in Mantua, for example, and then figure out how to translate that into literature.
And what did you find about his time in Mantua?
He had to have seen, it seems to me, the Sala di Troia in the Gonzaga's Palazzo Ducale in the north of Mantua, because what he describes in the poem Lucrece makes no sense whatsoever. It's absolutely dramatically inappropriate, but he decides to start describing what was on Lucrece's walls in terms of scenes from the Trojan War. And they match up with this has been established for 100 years. They match up with what is available in Mantua. So what do you do with that problem? But say, okay, well, maybe sailors got into inland Mantua and somehow got to see this Palazzo Ducale and see these images, and were so taken with them that they ran back to the Mermaid Tavern and blabbed about them. And little Shakespeare heard this and thought, wow, that's so cool, I have to go and ruin my poem immediately with these third-hand descriptions of art I've never seen. That's absurd.
All he had to do was Google it and find a lithograph image, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
That's the way I see it. That's the way I get to see that painting whenever I want to see that painting.
You know, when I started looking at that, you couldn't even do that really. They had some grainy black and white pictures, but we found when we got there, we got the best pictures ever because they were restoring the place and they let the light in, and it was glorious. After the earthquake that we had no idea about, and the place was closed to us for a couple of years.
So you've actually stood there and viewed that same painting that is so meticulously described in The Rape of Lucrece.
That's true. And also the Concilio di Dieci places too. And it is really an experience that is different from going to a museum and seeing a painting or looking at the Mona Lisa, because you are surrounded by this stuff. And it's all, Giulio Romano is known for his dramatic portrayals. So it's action and things are happening everywhere, and horses' necks are being twisted and people's arms are being chopped off. But you're surrounded by this all the way around and all through the ceilings too. And so the Sala di Troia is thought to have been, after serving as an armory appropriately to the Gonzaga family, to have been a guest chamber. So it's likely that, well, it's more than likely that if the Earl of Oxford was in Mantua He would have stayed with the main family, the Gonzagas, and he would have stayed at this chamber. So he would have woken up in the morning and had time before brunch to look around and absorb all these paintings that he's surrounded with. And there is the death of Patroclus. If you know your Homer, the death of Patroclus brings about the return of Achilles to the war, which is the main issue. Well, 2 years later, after Oxford returns, there is a dedicatory poem, the famous Latin poem by Gabriel Harvey, saying that thine eyes flash fire, something shakes, you shake a spear, but people don't give the second line to that usually, which is, who would not swear that Achilles had come to life again? So at least afterwards, he's being called an Achilles. And I don't know, maybe he's thinking or processing then, if that's not the first time, then whenever, you're called somebody heroic, you pay attention to that character. You may not even have ever heard of Achilles, but you start thinking, oh, well, I'm an Achilles. People think I am. And he makes the connection there. So there is a passage in Lucrece that refers to not being able to see the person, but you can see the spear instead. And the potential is that he's thinking of this image of an arm hiding the identity, but shaking a spear. And possibly that is the reference to Achilles.
And that's possibly the generation?
Will Shakespeare's.
Is that the generation then of the pseudonym, do you think, or it predates that?
We have no idea how this came about, but it sure does look like if that wasn't the impetus, then it's an acknowledgement that it was already in play, and that's in 1578. So something is going way earlier than thinking, oh, Shakespeare is not too far afield.
Well, and we've all seen the movie Troy, and we all remember the death of Patroclus as portrayed in that movie. And who doesn't want to be compared to Brad Pitt? I mean, let's think of it that way.
Right.
Tell me about another reference to another place or time in Italy that you have stood, where you have been, that you believe is connected to one of the plays of Shakespeare.
I would say overall, now that we have been to many cities, especially this year, that there are cities where I am confident to say he did not go. And everybody wants him to be everywhere. Everybody wants their super Oxford, and so do I. But we have not had traces in Palermo. He says that the Neapolitans in Napoli and Naples, they speak through the nose. Well, we've been there, and they speak through their mouths full of food, is what Colleen says. And so maybe that's the case.
I have family from there, Colleen. You better watch it.
Okay. Oops. That was just my simple impression. We have been to Milan. We've been to Genova. And so supposedly maybe has Oxford. One big problem is Messina, which he adamantly sets Much Ado About Nothing in. But is there any Messina in it? So what I come away saying this year is that he knows Venice very well. He probably knows Padua very well, even though we have still not been able to get there. And a couple of the northern cities, I think he knows Mantua really well. So this is Shakespeare country. Now you can count up the number of times he references Rome, but a lot of those are obligatory because of Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and so forth. Does he really know Rome? So I'm thrown back these days onto what sense do you get of the particular cities? Verona is another one, when he sets plays there. And I would say that you could superficially look at Taming of the Shrew in Padua, and you could look at Othello or Merchant of Venice in Venice and say, oh, well, that's the Italian system of really venerating money and influence and power. But they're inflected a little differently. and it's very subtle. And I think that indicates that he really knows those northern cities.
Well,
And then he disappears.
One of Petruchio's first lines is, Verona, I take my leave. So how about Verona? And obviously Verona, the famous Romeo and Juliet. What evidence do we have of his visiting Verona?
That's that Richard Roe material where he knows the trees outside the west gate or the east gate, and the sense of Verona and I would guess the family bit, but our problem is we haven't absorbed Verona enough as these other cities to get the sense of it and the feel of it, which you really have to do. And we have done that in Venice and Mantua. And even in Romeo and Juliet, the fact that the apothecary comes from Mantua and that the plague is going on there, and that's the big dramatic problem. All those things we're finding in the documents, and the fact that they love their apothecaries, and they're still there. There are these chemists who make the most fierce. It's called mostarda, and you kind of pickle fruit, but it's in this syrup that is so viciously hot that it is illegal to bring back into the country. And nobody believes I want it that hot. But you have to go basically to an apothecary get these things in Mantua.
I'll try it. I love hot foods. My wife talks all the time about my hot sauce shelf in the refrigerator. It's one whole shelf where there's at least a dozen different hot sauces. And she said, how do you know which one you want on which kind of food? I said, well, they all have a different flavor, different taste, and I use them for different things. That's why I have them.
Right, exactly. I'm a bit of a chemist on that myself. I have these blends of hot peppers that I dry, but you've got to try it. You got to try mostarda.
I long for that. Our middle daughter, we have 3 children. Our second daughter, her name is Siena, spelled like the city.
Hey. Great.
And it's named for the city, and named because we were planning a trip to Italy. We were going to do the Edward de Vere tour of Italy, and Siena was going to be one of the high points of our trip. And that's when we learned that we were pregnant and having a baby, and we had to cancel the whole trip. And so we decided that we were going to name her Siena in lieu of actually getting to see Siena.
That is perfect, because Colleen wants me to talk about Siena right now. It is one of my favorite top cities, my favorite cities. It is beautiful, gorgeous. It is walled. It is so medieval. It's crazy twice a year, but it's glorious. And the good news is we know that Edward de Vere was there in early January 1576. And so this is another determination we have. We have got to find out who he was staying with. We think the family Piccolomini is interesting because he is probably the author of the source play of Twelfth Night. And if Oxford is in Siena in early January 1576 and stayed a few more days, he would have seen the traditionally performed source play for what becomes Twelfth Night. The problem with Siena is there's no main family you stay with, like in Venice you stay with the Doge, or in Mantua you stay with the Gonzagas. But the Medicis are in charge of Tuscany at this time. And the reason we think we don't find anything in Florence is, although they're gossiping about him, there's no evidence he ever stayed there or passed through there. And if Catherine de' Medici in Paris is really the source horror behind Lady Macbeth and the slaughter of the Huguenots and so on, he might want nothing to do with hardcore Catholicism and the Medicis. So he passes by or passes through or sneaks by Florence and then gets to Siena maybe and wants to see the arts there. But then he's staying with private families. And beyond the archives, the state archives, we want to be tapping into the private archives of these individual families, or the academies, or the individual libraries that we are starting to explore now too.
I could see where he would have a distaste for both sides of the extreme zealous nature of religion, not only the extreme Catholics, not forgetting that the reign of Bloody Mary isn't that far behind them at that point in time in history. And then also seeing the extreme Protestants and the censorship and the closing down of theaters and that puritanical aspect, seems to me like a guy who is as cosmopolitan as he is, Neapolitan in that sense of the word, even though he obviously had a distaste for the Napolitanos. I could see where he would want to steer clear of either end of that, no matter what he was doing.
I agree. I think that he was as tired and weary of politics as he was of religion. And there are not many, obviously, you're traveling through Italy, you're going to see religious paintings all over the place. But that's not the material that makes its way into the works, unless it's Twelfth Night. I'm looking at images that he would have seen in that Consiglio di Dieci rooms that might have also influenced Twelfth Night and have more to do with the three kings and where they're from, the gifts and whatever else. That's a lead, but yeah, he's avoiding all of that nonsense and trying to make the individual family connections so that he doesn't have to check in with the authorities.
One of my favorite lines from Taming of the Shrew is when Vincenzo of Pisa shows up and finds his servant Tranio pretending to be his son Lucentio, and he says, thy father is a sailmaker from Bergamo." What evidence do we have of Oxford traveling through Bergamo? Anything at all?
We don't have anything, no. And this year we tried to guess, where is he going? And the only reason we really went to Bologna is that when you look north to south, no matter where you're going, when you're getting to Siena or Florence or farther down south, if he went, he probably went through Bologna. But again, we didn't find anything in the state archives there. So Bergamo, we know nothing. But I think that you can be in Italy and pick up on or hear about different regions and pick up enough that you can stereotype the people or just make that comment about Naples or make a comment about, another city, Milan or something, without actually giving the sense that you do get in the certain cities that he has really paid attention to. He's paid attention to their value system and all. But he knows those details. He knows that, I think, the history of that reference is that scholars said, well, that's just stupid because that's an inland city and they have nothing to do with sails. And then it proves that, no, Shakespeare always knows what he's talking about, and they were sailmakers. And the same with the canals, and the same with everything else that we keep discovering that gets dismissed, or Shakespeare, in the attempt to dumb him down, the insistence is, well, he's just guessing, or he didn't know, or he got it wrong. But check further and he always gets it right.
Well, it sure is great having boots on the ground representing this cause, and I know it's been wonderful having the two of you in Italy the last few years. Many of our listeners maybe aren't aware of Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's research grant project, and I know that has helped with a lot of this research. And it's one of the things that our organization is fully committed to, is because of our quest to find the truth. And it sure is fun to hear these details coming back to us from people who have an idea, who know what they're looking for and know where to look. And even if it means, like you say, some of the places where there's no evidence at all, at least that dismisses that location. And now that means we can focus more attention on the locations we do know where evidence exists. How long did he actually spend in Venice?
He gets there later than we'd like to think because he takes a detour towards Germany for a while, and then you got to wait until it's sufficiently springtime to cross the Alps. So we suspect he's been there. Maybe he gets there in May. It was thought that he took off in the summer because of plague, and that would give him an opportunity to get all over the place to Turkey and Greece and Illyria and the Far East and learn from the Maharishi and all this other nonsense. But really, we found that he's there in the first year we were there. We found that he is still there at the end of June when he wants to see these chambers. So we don't know when exactly he did take off, but he certainly did, and he did get to see a number of other cities. And as we say, Siena is one. One additional Siena connection is that, I don't know if people know this, but they have this crazy horse race, the Palio, every year. It takes place in early July and mid-August, 2 times. And it's there are these districts that you are born into in the Siena area, and you are that's your identity for your lifetime, no matter where you moved, who you marry. So, and the contrada are represented by the craziest symbols too. So they're not like native Italian animals. You could be a giraffe, or you could be a porcupine, or you could be a wave, which isn't even an animal. So it just is very disturbing. Anyway, they hire a mercenary jockey and a mercenary horse, and they try to get into the horse race at the center of town. And then everybody bets their entire businesses, and they say that they don't take it seriously. And a lot of people may, but they don't. But they all do, and they get crazy for months. And you're living in Italy, you're living in Siena, and you hear a month ahead of time these drums from the hillside, ba-da-da-da-dum, 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 and an hour later it's like ba-da-da-da-ba-ba-da. And I don't know if they're drinking while they're doing this, or they just get tired. And
drunken drummers.
But
the
it's
drunken drummers of Siena.
Palio.
That sounds like a touring band. Sienese drunken drummers. I love it.
So this is this medieval notion that ends up being a horse race that lasts 70 seconds. And out of 17 contrada, only 10 get to compete, and it's complete lotto. And the horse has to cross the line. The jockey doesn't have to be on it. And it's just nuts. And people go crazy, and they try to pillory the losing jockey, and they bet their lives on it. Anyway, so we're there. What we realized this year in trying to dig deeper than the archives is that we were told every contrada has its own archive going back to its origins. Some of them certainly to Edward de Vere's time and earlier too. So we had to wait till the end of Palio on August 16th, the second race. But we need to recontact these people and say, do you have materials from 1575-76? And this is the kind of stuff that the state archives doesn't have. This is digging way deeper into personal archives and personal letters. And that's the level at which the Earl of Oxford, we're finding, must have been operating on.
Well, that'll be fascinating to go back and explore. And if you're talking about, and how many of these different Stilgens for our Game of Thrones fans, how many of these different symbols, animals, contrados, you call them, exist? 17, you say?
There are 17 now. Some of them are latecomers. I don't know exactly how many were in operation in 1575-76.
But probably at least somewhere around 8, 9, or 10.
Yes, yeah, or more. Because this is serious. This is stuff.
They have their own parliamentarians or historians who are in charge of keeping these records. Each of them.
There are archivists for each of the contrada, we found out. So there's one main archivist who can get in touch with all the others and help us with our project. And that's the main thrust this year, that we we set ourselves up ahead of time, made contact with the archives and libraries, got to see way more places and got into way more places this time, and also made contacts and possibly people who can still help us even long distance now at this point. One of the new places was the Vatican Secret Archive. I was allowed to go in because I am professore, and Colleen couldn't get in. And this was a problem because, usually on most days she's better at the language and the system, and I'm better at the flipping through the documents. But our skills change back and forth, but we've always done this as a team together. But she was not allowed in because they were saying that there are too few seats, which didn't look to me to be the case. But I don't know. It was all very rule-bound and bureaucratic. And they took away my official letter of recommendation from my former department chair and never gave it back. And another place was
the one-time pass. This coupon is only redeemable once, and you cannot have it back to try to use it again.
I flashed that thing for 4 years, and it was perfectly fine. And nobody was really interested in it. But, suddenly the Vatican Secret Archive is. But, the Pope released these letters from the Nazi era. And so supposedly there were a whole lot of journalists there, trying to find out just how collaborative the Pope then was with the Nazis and so forth. But the bureaucracy is enjoyable usually. Before we first went, we were told, you probably can't have a notebook because you might steal the document. You certainly can't have a pen because you could mess up the documents. And you probably have to learn how to say in Italian, please turn the page, because somebody with a glove behind some glass is going to have to do it for you. And that was complete rubbish because there are so many documents, so many billions of documents that no archivist could ever think, where do you start to put this online? I don't want to say they don't care, because once they know they've got something, then they care, because they're really wondering what it is that we're after, and then it becomes hard to get.
They're hoping you'll do the work for them.
Most archives are happy to just put into your hands 500-year-old documents and let you flip through them.
That's fantastic. Recently we had our summer seminar up in Ashland, Oregon. And the library there at Southern Oregon University put out some of their ancient texts, Ben Jonson's first folio, the second edition of the folio of Shakespeare. They had all these books laid out. And we were concerned that we weren't allowed to touch them, and should we ask the special collections librarian to turn the pages? And finally she said, just turn to whatever page you want. I'm just glad to see them being used and appreciated by someone.
Yeah. Yes. And all the smaller archives like Mantua, they are really willing to help. And they realized that eventually, because after I was kind of paranoid initially. I didn't know how much to say about what we were doing or mention the name Shakespeare. But eventually once you explain that here's what you're doing, they get it and they realize, hey, this is important for our archive. So they were delighted when they got some press because we were there. And several years ago, the Oxfordian tour came through Mantua, and we were able to meet up with them and show them the archive. So that's great. The bigger archives like Venice, they get touchier and they're more into the bureaucracy. And so, for example, this year there was a hailstorm and a branch of a tree went down. And so they decided, we have to have people not in the main room because it's too dangerous. We can only have 10 people a day, and you can't get in, and we have to close at 2. And I think they really just wanted a vacation, because I don't think branches are apt to come down more after 2 p.m. than beforehand. But, we got kind of jerked around that way. But generally, the archives are very, very helpful and really want you to succeed. There is, for example, this really intriguing collection, an enormous collection of documents through the centuries called the Giusti di Giardino in Verona. And this is one of those families that Oxford might have been more interested in because they're involved in the arts than he would be with the state. Well, we were not. These are boxes and boxes, shelves and shelves, rows and rows of materials not yet indexed or really looked at in all this time. And it's been there for years, but we were with persistence, permitted to view some of the boxes that seemed maybe yet pertinent to us, even though nobody else has been looking at that stuff. So this is why I never expected that this would be this large a project, but it just keeps getting deeper and more promising as we expand our resources and the types of organizations that we're looking at their documents. We have widened our scope.
It's all very exciting. And I would think from the Italian nationalist perspective, they would want us to succeed in finding more and more evidence that connects the works of Shakespeare to someone who actually has visited Italy, who actually spent time there, who actually incorporated real Italy, real Italian culture into the works. 13 plays set in Italy is not a coincidence. And I would think that they would be some of the first proponents for finding the truth, because it would reflect better upon Italy and them as a whole.
That's right. They do. And they are so convinced that Shakespeare knows Italy so well that they've got their own candidates too. Now, everybody wants their own Shakespeare, but they have put forth the fact that, Shakespeare does know Italy, and I have been able to teach classes, telling the students there that I am so envious of you. It has taken me so long to get this act together and get here. But you guys in Mantua are in ground zero, Shakespeare country. This is way more important than Stratford. And I think especially with the Richard Roe book about the specific sites and finding out where is Shylock's house in the Cannaregio, in the ghetto, and elsewhere, that this would be way more exciting a tour for Shakespeare than anything else. Now, I like Mantua. It's a little small town, and I don't want to ruin it being, a big tourist attraction, but it should be for real Shakespeare, not fake Shakespeare.
I love that idea. And I love that you've shared that with them, and hopefully it awakens some young Italian scholars to assist with this work, since they are right there and in the middle of it all and have much easier access to it and don't have to take a giant long plane flight to get there.
That's right. And Noemi Magri was the Italian scholar previously, the late Noemi Magri, and we tried to understand what did she see, what didn't she see in the archive, but her records are much earlier, and we met with her younger brother too, but there's really no record of what she checked out to write the articles that she did about Oxford and Italy. And we don't want the same mistake to happen, because we have seen clearly many times the number of busta documents, envelopes, boxes of materials that she did. So one of our projects this year is, I don't know, it's not publishable really, but because it's just a bore of a list of things. But we have seen so much stuff that we want to leave this behind, so that anybody who wants to, check out further, you got to go past all these busta. We've looked at these, all these cities, and maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something we just haven't thought of in Mantua that we could additionally look for, or maybe there are other libraries that come to light. During our time recently, a letter from Leonardo da Vinci came to light someplace, and it was sent to Mantua because it was an invitation for Leonardo to paint a painting of some woman, and I don't think he ever did. But this was a big deal, and it's not that just because we're looking at materials from 400 and 500 years ago that it's all online, or that it's even in the archive. It's that more materials just keep coming to light. And unlike in the United States, in Italy or elsewhere, some drawer of yours that nobody in your family's looked at for several generations has stuff in it of interest.
We can only hope. Well, I know that we can expect the two of you to be delivering more information about your findings at this year's Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Annual Conference in Hartford, Connecticut, and I look forward to that. I'm so glad that we had you on the program for this episode. I know Colleen was there funneling you information, even though we didn't actually hear her voice today.
That's right.
But we'll definitely have to do a future episode about what it is that what your plan of attack is for the future. I look forward to seeing you both in Hartford and catching up at that time. And I want to thank you for taking some time with us to share this information with our fellow Quillers.
All right. Thank you very much. And people, look in your attics and clean out your basements and get with us.
Please do. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, you can download all of our episodes at your favorite podcast downloading site. Give us a rate and review if you would. Send us to the top. Visit don'tquillthepodcast.com. Don'tquillthepodcast.com to find out everything more you need to know about Don't Quill the Messenger, including our great Killer Quiller swag. Get yourself some Killer Quiller swag at don'tkillthepodcast.com. Don't forget, the program is sponsored by Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, your source and resource for everything you need to know about the Shakespeare authorship question. I'm your host, Stephen Sable, reminding you, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.